July 2nd, 1943, a scorching Texas morning. Captain Friedrich Weber knelt on the wooden floor of a warehouse in Camp Hearn, sweat pouring down his face, hands trembling as he held a single strip of bacon. Two tears
Something is
traced
wrong.
lines through the dust on his
We need
cheeks.
to move now.
The American guards standing nearby shifted uncomfortably,
I
unsure
won't
what
back
to
down.
do. They hadn't tortured
You can't
this
stop
man.
me, Ame.
They'd only given him breakfast. When Captain Friedrich Weber took his first bite of real American bacon on that blistering Texas morning in July 1943, something inside him shattered. Not his body, his beliefs. Everything the Third Reich had told him about America, everything he'd been trained to accept as gospel truth for 8 years crumbled with that single taste of smoked pork fat and salt. The lie wasn't just about food, it was about everything. But to understand why a decorated Nazi officer would weep over breakfast, you need to know what he expected to find in America. And what he found instead would not only save his life, it would change the course of the Cold War. Because Fritz Weber wasn't just any prisoner. He was a true believer. And true believers, when they break completely. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment when hatred first met kindness, to the day when ideology collided with a strip of hickory, smoked bacon. This is a story about food, yes, but it's really a story about what happens when everything you have been told turns out to be a lie. If your father or grandfather served in Texas during World War II, or if you remember hearing stories about German prisoners working on American farms, leave a comment below. This is a piece of American history that deserves to be remembered and shared. Because what happened in these Texas camps stayed classified for 30 years. When the files finally opened in 1973, historians found something nobody expected. Letters. Hundreds of letters from German prisoners of war begging not to be sent back to Germany after the war ended. Think about that for a moment. Enemy soldiers, men who had fought against American troops in North Africa and Europe, men who had pledged their lives to Adolf Hitler, writing desperate pleas to stay in the country they had been taught to hate. What could possibly transform a Nazi into someone who wanted to remain in Texas? The answer involves more fried chicken than you'd ever imagine, a pair of cowboy boots, in a kind of simple human decency that the Third Reich had no propaganda for. Over the next hour, I'll tell you the true story of Fritz Weber, a German officer who came to Texas expecting hell and found something that shattered everything he believed. A story of bacon and cowboys and the simple American kindness that won the war after the war was over. Fritz Weber was born in Munich in 1915, the son of a blacksmith. His mother died giving birth to his younger sister when Fritz was 5 years old. He grew up in the chaos that followed Germany's defeat in the First World War. Hyperinflation, poverty, hunger. By the time Fritz was 8 years old, a wheelbarrow full of money couldn't buy a loaf of bread. His father worked 14-hour days at the forge, and still the family went hungry most nights. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, Fritz was 18, desperate, angry at a world that had given him nothing but hardship. The Hitler Youth offered him something he'd never had before: purpose, food, a uniform, a sense of belonging. Fritz wasn't a monster. He was a young man who wanted to matter, who wanted to believe his suffering meant something. The Nazis gave him that belief. They gave him an enemy to hate and a future to fight for. By 1936, Fritz had joined the Wehrmacht. He wasn't SS, he wasn't a fanatic. But he believed Germany had been wronged after the First War. He believed the Treaty of Versailles had been a humiliation. He believed his country deserved to be great again. And he believed what his commanders told him about America. America, they said, was weak, soft, a nation of gangsters and jazz musicians and Jewish bankers, a country where people had starved during the Great Depression while the rich got richer. American soldiers, they said, were undisciplined cowboys with no stomach for real fighting. American food was slop barely fit for animals. American prisoners of war would be treated like slaves, worked to death, beaten, starved. Fritz believed all of this. Why wouldn't he? It came from his government, his officers, his Führer. And for 7 years, from 1936 to 1943, that belief sustained him through the invasion of Poland, through the conquest of France, through the brutal campaign in North Africa. Then in May 1943, everything changed. The Afrika Korps collapsed. Allied forces surrounded Fritz's unit near Tunisia. On May 12, 1943, Fritz became a prisoner of war. He was 28 years old. He expected to be executed within a week. The journey to America took 21 days by ship. Fritz and 200 other German prisoners were held in the cargo hold, given barely enough water to survive, fed thin soup and stale bread. By the time they reached the port of New Orleans, Fritz had lost 15 pounds. He was weak, dehydrated, convinced he was being transported to a death camp. The train ride from New Orleans to Texas took another 2 days. Through the small window of the prisoner car, Fritz saw America for the first time. Endless fields, vast open spaces, towns that looked nothing like the bombed-out ruins of Europe, and everywhere, in abundance he couldn't comprehend. Cars, buildings, people who looked well-fed. It had to be propaganda, Fritz told himself, a carefully staged show to demoralize the prisoners. The real America, the one Goebbels had described, must be somewhere else. When the train finally stopped at Camp Hearn on July 2, 1943, Fritz stepped off expecting barbed wire and guard towers and starvation rations. He got all of that. What he didn't expect was the smell, mesquite smoke, grilled beef, and something he'd never smelled before, something sweet and fatty and intoxicating. Real American barbecue. His stomach growled so loudly the guard escorting him glanced over. Fritz's ideology told him to refuse whatever food they offered. His body told him he was starving. The battle between his hunger and his hatred was about to begin. Camp Hearn sat 40 miles north of Austin in the heart of Texas cattle country. The camp had been built in 90 days by local construction companies thrown together to house the flood of Axis prisoners arriving from North Africa and Italy. By the summer of 1943, there were over 4,000 German prisoners at Hearn alone. Across Texas, there were 50,000. Across America, 425,000 enemy soldiers living behind barbed wire on American soil. Most Americans didn't know about the camps. It was classified, sensitive. The government didn't want people asking why they were feeding enemy soldiers 3 meals a day when American families were dealing with ration cards and victory gardens. But the camps existed, and they were unlike anything Fritz had been prepared for. As the guards marched Fritz and the other new arrivals through the main gate, he saw wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, a soccer field with real goals, a canteen where prisoners could buy Coca-Cola and candy with the script they earned from work details, a library filled with books in German, a small theater for showing movies. It had to be a trick, some kind of elaborate psychological warfare. Show the prisoners a comfortable camp, make them think they'd be treated well, then use it against Germany in propaganda. That had to be it. Fritz steeled himself. He would not be fooled. He would not betray his country. But there was one thing Fritz couldn't deny, couldn't rationalize away: the smell of food, real food, meat cooking over fire, bread baking, coffee, actual coffee, not the roasted grains substitute that passed for coffee in Germany. The smell filled the camp, unavoidable, maddening. At 4 in the afternoon on July 2nd, the new prisoners were marched to the mess hall for their first meal. Fritz walked inside and stopped. The room was clean, long tables with metal benches, and at the serving line, American soldiers in white aprons ladling food onto metal trays the size of small platters. Fritz picked up a tray, moved through the line, and watched as a bored-looking private piled food onto his plate. A piece of grilled beefsteak nearly an inch thick, a mound of mashed potatoes with a pat of butter melting into golden pools, green beans with bits of bacon mixed in, 2 slices of white bread, fresh, soft, still warm, a glass of milk, a cup of coffee. Fritz stood there holding his tray, staring at more food than he'd seen in a single meal since 1940. Around him, other prisoners were already eating. Some were crying as they ate, overwhelmed by the first real meal they'd had in months. Others ate in silence, mechanically, as if afraid the food would vanish if they acknowledged it. Fritz sat down, set his tray on the table, looked at the steak. The Americans had grilled it over mesquite wood the way Texas ranchers had cooked beef for 100 years. The smell was intoxicating. Sweet smoke, charred fat, salt and pepper. The mashed potatoes were real, not powder, not substitute. Real potatoes with butter. The green beans had bacon in them. Bacon. In the vegetables. His stomach cramped with hunger. His mouth watered uncontrollably. But Fritz was an officer. He had a duty. He had to set an example for the other men. He could not give in to this American manipulation. Fritz stood up, walked out of the mess hall, left the entire tray of food untouched. Back in his assigned barracks, Fritz lay on his bunk and tried not to think about the steak, tried not to think about the butter melting into those potatoes, tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing. Around him, the other prisoners who'd eaten were quiet, subdued, dealing with their own confusion about a meal that contradicted everything they had been told. An hour later, the door to the barracks opened. A young American soldier walked in. Corporal James Hayes, though Fritz didn't know his name yet, 22 years old, lean and sun-darkened from farm work. He looked at Fritz, then at the empty bunk beside him. The soldier walked over, set something on the bunk, a Hershey's chocolate bar, a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, a bottle of Coca-Cola beaded with condensation. The soldier spoke in slow, careful English. "You didn't eat, Captain. You sick." Fritz understood enough English to respond. His voice came out harsh, defensive. "I am not hungry." The American soldier almost smiled. "Bull, I heard your stomach growling from across the yard." He gestured to the items on the bunk. "Look, I don't know what they told you about us, but we don't starve prisoners here. Geneva Convention and all that. Plus, it's a waste of good Texas beef if you don't eat it." The soldier turned to leave, then paused. "Name's Jimmy Hayes, by the way. I'll be checking on this barracks most days. See you at breakfast, Captain. We're having bacon and eggs." After Jimmy left, Fritz stared at the three items on the bunk. The chocolate bar had a label he'd seen in propaganda films. American Decadence. The cigarettes were the same. But the Coca-Cola, that was different. He'd heard about Coca-Cola, the Jewish capitalist poison that was rotting American youth. He'd never seen a bottle in person. The bottle was cold, impossibly cold in this Texas heat. Condensation dripped onto the wool blanket. Fritz was thirsty. The train ride had left him dehydrated. His tongue felt thick in his mouth. "It's just water," he told himself. "Just colored sugar water. It can't hurt to drink it. I need fluids." Fritz opened the bottle. The sound of the cap coming off the hiss of carbonation filled the quiet barracks. He brought the bottle to his lips, took a small sip, cold, sweet. The carbonation fizzed on his tongue, sharp and clean. He'd never tasted anything like it. He told himself to put it down, to resist, to maintain his principles. Instead, Fritz drank the entire bottle in 30 seconds, gasped for air, looked at the empty bottle in his hand like it was evidence of a crime. That night, lying in his bunk, Fritz couldn't sleep, not because of discomfort. The bunk was better than what he'd slept on for the past 3 years in the Wehrmacht, not because of noise. The barracks were quiet except for the soft breathing of exhausted men. He couldn't sleep because he kept thinking about one thing. If the Coca-Cola was that good, if it was nothing like what the propaganda had described, what would the bacon taste like day 2, July 3rd? Fritz skipped breakfast. He heard the other prisoners talking about it afterward. Eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, real jam, coffee, orange juice. The men spoke in hushed, guilty tones as if enjoying the food was a betrayal. Fritz skipped lunch, skipped dinner. By the evening of July 3rd, he was weak, dizzy, but he held firm. He would not give in. He would not let the Americans win. Klaus Schneider, a private who'd been captured alongside Fritz in Tunisia, approached him that evening. Klaus had eaten all 3 meals. He looked healthier already, color returning to his face. "Captain," Klaus said quietly, "we thought you were insane. The Americans are feeding us better than our own army fed us in 1940. Real meat, real coffee, and you refuse to eat. Sir, with respect, you're going to die of stubbornness." Fritz turned away. "It's a trick, Schneider. They're fattening us up for something. Propaganda. They'll photograph us looking well-fed and use it against the fatherland bomb." Klaus was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Fritz would remember for the rest of his life. "Sir, I think you're not refusing because you think it's a trick. I think you're refusing because you're scared. Scared that if the propaganda was wrong about the food, what else was it wrong about?" Fritz wanted to argue, but he had no answer. Day 3, July 4th, American Independence Day. Though Fritz didn't know that, he skipped all 3 meals again. By evening, he was shaking, his vision blurred at the edges. He'd gone 72 hours with nothing but that bottle of Coca-Cola. At 11 that night, long after lights out, the door to the barracks opened again. Jimmy Hayes stepped inside carrying something wrapped in a cloth napkin. He walked directly to Fritz's bunk. Fritz sat up groggy weak. Jimmy unwrapped the napkin. Inside were 3 strips of bacon from that morning's breakfast. Still warm, Jimmy had reheated them on a camp stove. "Captain," Jimmy said, his voice low so as not to wake the others, "this is getting ridiculous. You're going to die of stubbornness, and I'll get blamed for it." He set the napkin on Fritz's bunk. The smell of the bacon filled the small space around them. Rich, smoky, salty. Fritz's stomach cramped so hard he almost doubled over. The bacon wasn't like the thin, flimsy strips you might find today. This was thick-cut hickory, smoked Texas bacon from a local farm. Each strip was nearly a quarter-inch thick, with bands of deep red meat and creamy white fat. It had been cooked slow until the fat turned translucent and crispy at the edges, and the meat darkened to a rich mahogany. The smell was overwhelming, smoky, salty, sweet from the pork fat caramelizing. It filled the entire barracks. Jimmy looked at Fritz with something like pity. "Look, you can hate America all you want. You can hate me, but don't insult my mama's cooking. This is Texas bacon, son, and it don't deserve to be refused." For a long moment, Fritz just stared at the bacon. His ideology screamed at him to refuse. His pride demanded he maintain his resistance, but his body was shutting down. He was dying. He knew it, and for what? To prove a point to himself, Fritz picked up a strip of bacon. His hand trembled. He could feel Jimmy watching him, could feel the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. He bit into the bacon. The fat melted on his tongue instantly. Rich, silky, with just a hint of smoke that seemed to coat the inside of his mouth. The meat was tender, but had a slight chew with salt crystals that burst across his palate in waves of flavor. The sweetness of the caramelized pork fat, the char from the edges, the pepper and smoke. Fritz had eaten pork before. Germany had pork, but it had been rationed thin-boiled slices during the worst years. Nothing in his entire life had prepared him for this. This wasn't pork. This was something else entirely. This was abundance. This was care and preparation. This was food made by someone who had enough, who could afford to take time, who treated cooking as something more than mere survival. He ate all 3 strips in silence. Tears ran down his face, though he didn't acknowledge them. When he finished, he looked up at Jimmy Hayes, this 22-year-old farm boy from a country he'd been taught to hate with every fiber of his being. For the first time in 3 days, Captain Friedrich Weber spoke the truth. "It was good," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Jimmy grinned. "Wait till you try Mama's fried chicken. That's when things get interesting." After Fritz surrendered to the bacon, something shifted in the careful architecture of his hatred. Not a collapse, not yet, but a crack, a hairline fracture in the foundation of everything he'd been taught to believe. He started eating regularly. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Each meal was better than anything he'd eaten in 3 years of war. But Fritz told himself it meant nothing. The Americans had food to spare. That was all. It didn't change who they were. It didn't change who he was. The first 2 weeks at Camp Hearn passed in a strange fog of cognitive dissonance. Fritz ate American food while telling himself it proved nothing. He slept in a clean bunk with real sheets while convincing himself it was all propaganda. He watched American guards treat prisoners with casual indifference rather than cruelty, and decided they were simply following orders no different from German guards. But the crack kept widening because food isn't just fuel. Food is culture. Food is care. And every meal Fritz ate was prepared by someone who gave a damn about how it tasted. The biscuits at breakfast weren't just flour and water. They were light, flaky, brushed with butter. The coffee wasn't burned grain. It was rich and dark with a hint of chicory. Someone somewhere was putting effort into feeding enemy soldiers, and Fritz couldn't understand why. In the second week of July, everything changed again. The camp commander announced a new program. Prisoners who volunteered for work details would earn script that could be used at the camp canteen. More importantly, they'd be working alongside American civilians on farms and ranches throughout Texas. The labor shortage was desperate. American men were overseas fighting. The crops needed harvesting. The fences needed mending. And there were 4,000 German prisoners sitting in Camp Hearn with nothing to do. Fritz volunteered immediately, not because he wanted to help America, because he needed to understand. He needed to see the real America, the one beyond the camp gates, the America that Goebbels had described. Poor, desperate, barely holding together. That America had to exist somewhere. On August 3rd, 1943, Fritz boarded a truck with 20 other prisoners. They drove 40 miles west to a ranch called Smithson, 5,000 acres of cattle country, endless sky, grass that stretched to the horizon, and a ranch house that looked bigger than any home Fritz had ever seen. The foreman waiting for them was a man named Bill Thompson. Everyone called him Wild Bill. He was 35 years old but looked 50, weathered by sun and wind, lean and hard from a lifetime of physical labor. He wore a sweat-stained cowboy hat, scuffed boots, and a leather vest over a faded work shirt. He looked at the line of German prisoners in their faded Wehrmacht uniforms and spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Any of you boys know how to fix fence?" Wild Bill asked. Silence. Fritz understood the question. He stepped forward. "No, but I can learn." Wild Bill looked at him for a long moment. Then he tossed Fritz a pair of leather work gloves. "You ever fixed fence before, Captain?" "No." "Well, you're about to learn, and let me tell you, the barbed wire don't care if you're German or American. It'll cut you all the same." Fritz spent the next 8 hours digging post holes in Texas heat that topped 105 degrees. The ground was hard, rocky. Each hole took 20 minutes of steady work with a manual post hole digger. His back screamed. His hands, even protected by the gloves, developed blisters that burst and reformed. Sweat soaked through his uniform until the gray fabric turned black. Wild Bill worked beside him the entire time. This man, 20 years older than Fritz, worked at twice the speed, digging holes, setting posts, stringing barbed wire with practiced efficiency. He didn't talk much, didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. At noon, Wild Bill called a break. He walked to his truck and pulled out a metal lunchbox. Opened it. Inside were 2 thick sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Roast beef on white bread with cheese and mustard, a jar of pickles, 2 pieces of apple pie wrapped separately. Wild Bill unwrapped one sandwich, held it out to Fritz. Didn't say a word, just offered it. Fritz hesitated. The other prisoners were eating from their own rations, standard camp food brought in a truck. This was Wild Bill's personal lunch, his own food. "I cannot take your food," Fritz said. Wild Bill kept holding out the sandwich. "Out here ain't no German or American. Just 2 men fixing fence. And a man can't work on empty stomach." Fritz took the sandwich, bit into it. The beef was tender, still moist from being cooked rare. The cheese was sharp, real cheddar. The bread was soft, fresh baked. It was a simple sandwich, nothing fancy, but it was made with care, made to be enjoyed. They ate in silence for a while. Then Wild Bill spoke. "You did good work this morning, Captain. For a city boy." "I am not city boy," Fritz said, his English improving daily. "My father was blacksmith." Wild Bill's expression changed slightly. Not quite a smile, but something like respect. "Blacksmith? Hell, that's honest work. You'll do fine out here." That afternoon, something happened that Fritz couldn't explain, couldn't rationalize away. Wild Bill showed him how to splice barbed wire, how to twist it tight so the fence would hold against cattle pushing through. It was skilled work, work that took practice. And Wild Bill taught Fritz, patiently correcting his mistakes without judgment, showing him again when he got it wrong. Why? The question gnawed at Fritz as he worked. Why would this American cowboy take time to teach an enemy soldier a useful skill? Why share his lunch? Why treat him like a human being rather than a prisoner? By the end of the day, Fritz had helped repair 200 yards of fence. His hands were destroyed. His back felt like someone had beaten it with a pipe. But the fence was solid. The work was real. And when Wild Bill nodded approvingly at the finished section, Fritz felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pride in honest labor. The truck ride back to camp was quiet. Fritz sat in the back with the other prisoners, watching the Texas landscape roll past in the fading light. Cattle grazing, windmills turning slowly, a sky so vast it made Germany feel claustrophobic by comparison. Klaus Schneider sat beside him. Klaus had worked a different detail, harvesting cotton in fields 10 miles south. "How was the ranch?" Klaus asked. Fritz didn't answer right away. How could he explain what he'd felt? How could he describe the contradiction of being treated with basic human decency by the enemy? It was work, Fritz finally said. Hard work. Klaus nodded. Then quietly, the family that owns the cotton farm, they gave us lemonade at lunch, real lemonade. Ice, the woman who brought it out, her son died at Normandy. She knew we were German. She gave us lemonade anyway. The two men sat in silence as the truck bounced along the dirt road. Around them, other prisoners were having similar quiet conversations, sharing similar confusions. Because every day in small ways, America was dismantling their hatred with ordinary kindness, and none of them knew how to process it. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday in late August, Fritz was back at Smithson Ranch with a smaller crew. Just 6 prisoners this time. They were reinforcing a section of fence near a creek far from the main ranch buildings. The work was routine. Fritz had learned the rhythm of it. Dig, set, string, move on. Around 2 in the afternoon, Jimmy Hayes, who'd been assigned as the guard for this detail, stepped wrong on a loose rock. His ankle turned sharply. Fritz heard the pop from 20 feet away. Jimmy went down hard, his face white with pain. Wild Bill was back at the ranch house half a mile away. The truck was with him. It was just Fritz, 5 other prisoners, and Jimmy, who clearly couldn't walk. The nearest building was a barn 2 miles through rough terrain. Fritz stood there for exactly 20 seconds, calculating. This was an opportunity. Texas was huge. The Mexican border was 200 miles south. He could run. He could disappear. He was strong enough, now well-fed enough. He could survive. But Jimmy was looking at him. Not with fear, not with suspicion, just pain and a kind of resigned trust. "Captain," Jimmy said through gritted teeth, "I can't walk. Need you to help me back." Fritz looked at the other prisoners, looked at the empty landscape, looked back at Jimmy Hayes, this kid who'd brought him bacon when he was starving himself to death. Fritz knelt down, pulled Jimmy's arm over his shoulder, lifted him up. "You are too heavy," Fritz said. "American food make you fat." Jimmy managed a pained laugh. "Ain't the food, it's Mama's pecan pie." They walked 2 miles in 45 minutes. Fritz supporting most of Jimmy's weight. His shoulder ached. His legs burned. Sweat poured down his face in the afternoon heat. But he didn't stop, didn't rest, just kept walking. When they finally reached the barn, Wild Bill was there, having come looking for them when the crew didn't return on schedule. He took one look at Jimmy's ankle, already swollen to twice its normal size, and helped get him into the truck. Then Wild Bill turned to Fritz. "Obliged, Captain." That was all he said. But the way he said it, the tone carried more weight than a speech. It was acknowledgement. Man to man, not prisoner to guard, not enemy to enemy, just one person recognizing another's decency. That evening, after the prisoners were back at camp after dinner, after the sun had set, and the barracks were settling into nighttime quiet, the door opened. Wild Bill stood there, unusual because civilians rarely came into the camp after dark. He carried something wrapped in oiled leather. He walked directly to Fritz's bunk, set the leather bundle down. "This belonged to my brother," Wild Bill said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Grief, maybe, or memory. "He died at Normandy last year." Wild Bill unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a pair of cowboy boots, real leather, hand-tooled with intricate designs along the shaft, worn but well-maintained. The leather was soft, broken in, but not broken down. "You helped my friend today," Wild Bill continued. "That counts for something. These boots, they're for working. And you're a working man now." Fritz picked up one of the boots. The leather was buttery soft, the craftsmanship obvious even to his untrained eye. These weren't mass-produced military boots. These were made by someone who understood that boots were a cowboy's most important tool. They would have cost a month's wages, maybe more. "I cannot," Fritz stammered. "Your brother, he died fighting my country. I cannot take his boots." Wild Bill was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was firm. "My brother would want them on the feet of a man who works honest. Don't matter if them feet walked for Hitler or Roosevelt. Honest work is honest work." He turned to leave, then paused. "They're a size 10. Should fit you. Try 'em on tomorrow." After Wild Bill left, Fritz sat on his bunk holding the boots. Around him, the other prisoners pretended not to notice, but he could feel their attention. could feel the weight of what had just happened. Klaus Schneider finally spoke. "Are you going to wear them?" Fritz didn't answer. He just sat there holding boots that belonged to a dead American soldier, boots given to him by that soldier's brother, boots that represented something Fritz couldn't name but desperately wanted to understand. The next morning, Fritz put on the boots. They fit perfectly, comfortable in a way his military boots had never been. The leather molded to his feet like they'd been waiting for him. When he walked out to the morning work detail, Wild Bill saw the boots. Nodded once, didn't say anything, didn't need to. That day, Fritz worked harder than he'd ever worked in his life. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. Because wearing those boots meant something. It meant he'd been seen as a man, not a prisoner. It meant someone had trusted him with something precious. It meant that maybe, just maybe, everything he'd believed about America was wrong. The weeks rolled on into September. Fritz fell into a routine. Work details 5 days a week. Sundays off. He was learning English faster, now picking it up from Jimmy and Wild Bill and the other ranch hands. He was putting on weight muscle from the physical labor and good food. His skin darkened in the Texas sun until he didn't look that different from the American cowboys he worked alongside. Klaus Schneider was changing too, but in a different way. Klaus had embraced America with an enthusiasm that bordered on zealotry. He wore American-style clothes whenever possible, listened to American jazz on the camp radio, drank Coca-Cola every day, started playing baseball with a passion that confused the German officers. The tension between them grew. Not hostile, just the tension between two men processing the same information in opposite ways. One night in late September, they finally talked about it. Fritz, Klaus said, using his first name, something he'd never done before. "The war is ending. Everyone knows it. Germany is losing. Why are you still holding on to loyalty, to a country that lied to us about everything?" Fritz sat on his bunk, cleaning the cowboy boots with Neat's foot oil the way Wild Bill had shown him. "I'm not holding loyalty. I'm just confused." "Confused about what?" "About who I am now. I was Fritz Weber, German soldier. Now I am Fritz Weber, German prisoner, who eats American food and wears American boots and works alongside American cowboys. When the war ends, when I go back to Germany, who will I be then?" Klaus leaned forward. "What if you don't go back?" Fritz looked up sharply. "That's desertion. It's survival. Fritz, have you written to your family? Have you tried to contact your father?" Fritz hadn't. The camp allowed letters, but they were censored. He was afraid. Afraid of what he might say. Afraid of admitting that everything had changed. "When you do right," Klaus said quietly, "what will you tell them? That the Americans are monsters, that we're being tortured? Or will you tell them the truth, that we're being treated better than we ever were in the Wehrmacht?" Fritz had no answer, because Klaus was right. The truth was impossible to write. The truth would be seen as propaganda, as coercion. His family would think he'd been broken, and maybe he had been, but not by torture, by kindness, by bacon and boots and ordinary human decency. October arrived. The Texas heat finally broke into something resembling autumn, though it was still warmer than summer in Munich. On the first Sunday of October, Wild Bill approached Fritz with an unusual invitation. "My family's having Sunday dinner," Wild Bill said. "You're invited if you want to come." This was rare. Prisoners occasionally worked on farms, but socializing with American families was heavily discouraged. It required permission, paperwork, a guard present at all times. "Jimmy will come as guard," Wild Bill added. "Make it all official. My wife's cooking. Figured you might appreciate a home-cooked meal instead of camp food." Fritz agreed before he fully processed what he was agreeing to. The following Sunday, he rode in Wild Bill's truck to a ranch house 10 miles from camp. Jimmy sat in the back, rifle across his lap, fulfilling his official duty while clearly looking forward to his own mother's cooking. Mrs. Hayes was coming too. It was turning into a gathering. When they arrived, Fritz's first thought was how normal it all looked. The house was modest but well-maintained. White paint, a porch with rocking chairs, a yard with grass that someone had clearly spent time caring for. Chickens pecked around the property. A dog, some kind of hound mix, ambled over to sniff Fritz before deciding he was acceptable. Inside, the house smelled like heaven. Frying chicken, baking bread, something sweet, probably pie. Wild Bill's wife Martha was in the kitchen. She was 33, lean and capable looking, her hair pulled back in a practical bun. When she saw Fritz, her expression was polite but cool, not hostile, just reserved. "Welcome, Captain Weber," she said. "Please sit." The dining table was already set, more place settings than Fritz expected. Two neighboring families were joining them, 12 people total. Fritz suddenly realized he was the only German in a room full of Americans, the only enemy soldier at an American Sunday dinner. The table was laden with food. Fried chicken piled high on a cast iron platter, mashed potatoes, green beans, corn on the cob, biscuits, gravy, and in the center an apple pie that smelled like cinnamon and butter and everything good about autumn. Fritz sat where Martha indicated. The seat at the table put him next to Mr. Davis, a man in his 50s who'd been introduced as a neighboring rancher. Mr. Davis had been quiet during the introductions. Fritz noticed the man's eyes, hard, assessing. Later, Fritz would learn that Mr. Davis had lost his son at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, the first major engagement between American and German forces in North Africa. The battle where the inexperienced American troops were badly beaten by the Afrika Korps. Mr. Davis's boy had died there. And now here was Fritz, a German officer who might have fought in that same battle, sitting at Sunday dinner. The meal began with Wild Bill saying grace. Fritz, not understanding all the words but recognizing the ritual, bowed his head respectfully. Then the food started moving around the table, platters passing hand to hand, the communal sharing of abundance. Mrs. Hayes, Jimmy's mother, served the fried chicken. She used tongs to transfer pieces from the platter to plates. When she reached Fritz, she placed two pieces on his plate, a thigh and a wing. The chicken was still hot enough that steam rose from it. Fritz looked at the chicken, really looked at it. The crust wasn't just crispy, it was architectural. Layers of seasoned flour had built up during the frying process, creating a shell that was simultaneously delicate and substantial. The color was deep amber, almost mahogany, in the darker spots where the chicken had sat against the bottom of the Dutch oven. When Mrs. Hayes had moved it with the tongs, Fritz heard it, the crack of the crust, the sound of something perfectly fried. Everyone was watching him, not obviously, but he could feel it. 12 Americans watching to see how the German prisoner would react to home cooking. Fritz picked up the chicken thigh. It was hot, almost too hot to hold. He brought it to his mouth and bit through the crust. The sound it made was audible across the table, a sharp crack as his teeth broke through the outer layer. Hot fat immediately flooded his mouth. The meat beneath the crust was impossibly tender, so moist it almost fell apart. The seasoning was complex. Salt, yes, black pepper, but also garlic powder, cayenne for heat, paprika for sweetness, and something else, something he couldn't identify. Later, he'd learn it was the buttermilk brine which had tenderized the meat and added a subtle tang that balanced the richness of the fried coating. Fritz closed his eyes. He didn't mean to. It just happened. Because in that moment, everything else disappeared. The war, his uniform, his identity as a prisoner. All that existed was this piece of chicken and the overwhelming realization that food could be this good, that someone could care enough about cooking to achieve this level of perfection. When he opened his eyes, Mrs. Hayes was watching him, not with suspicion, not with hostility, but with the expression of someone who knows they've done something well and is waiting for acknowledgement. "How is it, Captain?" she asked. Fritz realized he'd been silent too long. He searched for the English words, couldn't find ones that felt adequate, so he spoke the simple truth. "I think this is the best thing I ever eat in my life." The table went silent. Then Mrs. Hayes smiled. It was the first genuine smile an American woman had given him since he had arrived in Texas. "Well then," she said, "you better have another piece." After the meal, after the table had been cleared and the dishes washed and put away, Fritz found himself on the porch with Wild Bill. The sun was setting over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible, too vivid to be real. They sat in rocking chairs drinking coffee that was strong and black and nothing like the ersatz substitutes Fritz had consumed for years in Germany. The other guests had left. Martha was inside with Mrs. Hayes talking quietly about things Fritz couldn't hear. Jimmy was throwing a ball for the hound dog in the yard. The evening air had cooled to something almost pleasant, and for the first time since arriving in America, Fritz felt something close to peace. Wild Bill didn't speak for a long time, just rocked slowly in his chair, sipping coffee, looking out at land that his family had worked for 3 generations. Finally, without looking at Fritz, he spoke. You did good work out at the ranch this month. The fence is holding better than it has in years. You got a talent for it. Fritz didn't know how to respond to praise from an enemy, from a man whose country he'd fought against. So he said nothing. Wild Bill continued, I've been thinking about something, about why you're here, about what it all means. He paused. You know what I think war is, Fritz? It's old men's hatred played out with young men's bodies. You and me, we got no quarrel. We never did, but we got put on opposite sides and told to hate each other. Fritz felt something tighten in his chest. I did hate you. I was taught to hate America, to hate everything you stand for. I know, Wild Bill said. And what you thinking now? The question hung in the air between them. Fritz took a long drink of coffee, using the time to find words for something he'd been avoiding for weeks. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. I think they lie to us about everything. Wild Bill nodded slowly. War's full of lies, Fritz, both sides. But out here, he gestured to the darkening prairie, out here ain't no lies, just land and people working it. You worked honest today, ate honest food. That's the truth of America right there. Fritz's hands were shaking. He set down his coffee cup so Wild Bill wouldn't see. But I fight against you. My unit, we kill American boys. I kill American boys. Yeah, Wild Bill said. His voice was steady, no judgment in it. Just acknowledgement of fact. And American boys killed your friends. War's a terrible thing, but we can't change the past. We can only decide what we do now. What I do now, Fritz heard the desperation in his own voice. Wild Bill turned to look at him directly. You keep working, keep learning. And when this war ends, whenever that is, you go home and tell people what you saw here. Tell them Americans ain't devils. We're just folks trying to get by, same as anybody. That might not stop the next war, but it might make one person think twice. Fritz felt his throat constrict, felt tears building behind his eyes. For 8 years, he'd carried a burden of hatred so heavy it had shaped his entire identity. And now this cowboy, this simple Texas rancher, was telling him he could put it down, just set it aside like a tool he no longer needed. I don't know how to stop hating, Fritz whispered. Wild Bill put a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was firm but kind. Start by admitting you already have. You stopped hating the moment you ate that bacon. Everything since then has just been you fighting against what you already know is true. Something broke inside Fritz then, not violently, more like ice cracking on a frozen lake. A fundamental shift in the structure of who he was. He put his face in his hands and cried. Not the quiet tears he'd shed eating bacon in the dark, but real crying. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and hurts on the way out. Wild Bill didn't tell him to stop. Didn't tell him men don't cry, just kept his hand on Fritz's shoulder and let him break. When Fritz finally caught his breath when the tears slowed, Wild Bill spoke again. It's okay, son. Let it out. Takes courage to admit you were wrong. More courage than it takes to keep being wrong just because it's easier. They sat in silence for a while longer. The stars were coming out now, more stars than Fritz had ever seen. No blackout curtains in Texas. No bombed cities blocking the light. Just an endless sky full of possibilities. The ride back to camp was quiet. Jimmy drove understanding without being told that something significant had happened. Fritz sat in the passenger seat watching Texas roll past in the darkness, feeling lighter than he had in years. Feeling for the first time since childhood like maybe the future didn't have to be defined by the past. The weeks that followed were a study in transformation. Fritz threw himself into work with an intensity that surprised even Wild Bill. He volunteered for every detail, learned to rope cattle, helped with the fall branding, fixed water pumps, mended gates. By late October, he could ride a horse well enough to help move cattle from one pasture to another. The other prisoners noticed the change in him. Some followed his example. Others, the hardcore Nazi loyalists, began to view him with suspicion. There were still true believers in Camp Hearn, men who listened to German radio broadcasts on smuggled receivers, Men who held secret meetings and maintained discipline according to Wehrmacht regulations. Men who saw Fritz's transformation as betrayal. Klaus Schneider was fully Americanized now. He'd stopped wearing his Wehrmacht uniform whenever possible, opting for donated civilian clothes. He played baseball every evening with the camp team, drank Coca-Cola like water, started using American slang that made the guards laugh. Klaus represented one extreme. The hardcore Nazis represented the other. And Fritz existed somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, trying to reconcile who he'd been with, who he was becoming. One evening in early November, a prisoner named Otto Becker, a former SS officer who'd been transferred to Herne from another camp, confronted Fritz in the barracks. "You disgrace the uniform," Otto said in German. His voice was cold. "Wearing American boots, eating their food with gratitude, working for them like a slave." Fritz looked at the man. Otto was everything Fritz had once aspired to be. Tall, rigid, absolutely certain of his righteousness. Looking at him now was like looking at a photograph of himself from 6 months ago. "I'm not working like a slave," Fritz replied. "I'm working like a man. There's a difference." "There is no difference when you work for the enemy." "Who is the enemy, Otto?" "The Americans who feed us 3 meals a day, who pay us for our labor, who give us medical care and libraries and soccer fields, or the government that sent us to die in Africa and left us here." Otto's face reddened. "You dare question the Fuhrer?" Fritz stood up. He was taller than Otto, broader now from months of ranch work and good food. "The Fuhrer told us Americans were subhuman, that they were weak, that they would starve and torture us. I have been here 4 months. I have not been starved. I have not been tortured. I have been treated with more dignity than I ever received in the Wehrmacht. So yes, I question him." Several other prisoners had gathered around watching the confrontation. The barracks was silent except for the 2 men. Otto stepped closer. "You will be reported. When we return to Germany, you will answer for this treason." Fritz didn't back down. "If believing that Americans are human beings makes me a traitor, then I'm a traitor. I can live with that." Otto spat at Fritz's feet and walked away. But the damage was done. The camp was divided now. And Fritz knew that for some men his transformation would never be forgiven. The incident with Otto made Fritz realize something. He needed to make a choice. He couldn't exist in the middle anymore. He couldn't keep one foot in his German identity and one foot in this new understanding. He had to commit. That night he did something he'd been avoiding for 4 months. He wrote a letter home. To his father. The old blacksmith in Munich who'd raised him after his mother died. The man who'd gone hungry so Fritz could eat. The man who'd been proud when Fritz joined the Wehrmacht. The letter took him 3 hours to write. He crossed out sentences. Started over. Struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like propaganda, that wouldn't sound like he'd been coerced. In the end, he wrote the simple truth. "Father, I am alive and well. I am a prisoner in America in a place called Texas. I know what you have been told about America. I believe those same things. I was wrong. The Americans treat us with fairness. We are fed well. We work for wages. We are allowed to send letters to receive packages to maintain our dignity. I have learned that the enemy is not what we were told. They are farmers and cowboys and families much like us. I have learned that propaganda works both ways. I have learned that hatred is easier than understanding, but understanding is more honest. I don't know when I will see you again. I don't know what Germany will be when this war ends. But I know that I am no longer the same man who left Munich in 1936. That man believed lies. This man has seen the truth. I hope you can forgive me for that. Your son, Friedrich," he sealed the letter, gave it to the camp postal officer, knew it would be read by censors on both sides, knew his father might never receive it, knew that if his father did receive it, he might not understand. But Fritz had to send it anyway, because Wild Bill was right. You can't change the past. You can only decide what to do now. November became December. The war news filtering into the camp was increasingly grim for Germany. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Italy had surrendered. Allied bombers were destroying German cities. The prisoners listened to sanitized German broadcasts and uncensored American news and tried to piece together the truth from the gap between them. Fritz stopped listening to the German broadcasts entirely. He read American newspapers that were allowed in the camp. followed the progress of the war from the Allied perspective. It was strange reading about your own country's defeats and feeling something like relief, because every German defeat meant the war was closer to ending, and the war ending meant this insanity could stop. Christmas 1943 arrived. Fritz had never experienced an American Christmas before. The camp administration, in conjunction with local churches, organized a celebration. A Christmas tree in the main hall, donated gifts for the prisoners, a special meal prepared by the camp kitchen staff with help from local women, including Mrs. Hayes. The Christmas dinner was extravagant by wartime standards. Roast turkey, ham, stuffing, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, rolls, 3 different kinds of pie. The prisoners sat at long tables, many of them crying quietly as they ate, thinking about Christmases past, about families they might never see again. Fritz sat with Klaus and a few other prisoners who'd become friends. They ate in silence for a while. Then Klaus raised his cup of apple cider. "To surviving," Klaus said. "To surviving," the others echoed. But Fritz didn't drink, because surviving wasn't enough anymore. Surviving was passive, accepting what happened to you and enduring it. Fritz didn't want to just survive. He wanted to understand. He wanted to become something different. He wanted transformation. He raised his cup. "To becoming," he said. The others looked at him confused, but they drank anyway. After dinner, there was singing. Traditional German Christmas carols that the prisoners knew from childhood. Silent Night, originally written in German. O Tannenbaum. The guards stood respectfully at the edges of the hall, letting the prisoners have this moment of connection to home. Some of the guards sang along, their American accents mangling the German words, but their intention clear. Fritz sang, but halfway through Silent Night, he found himself crying again. Not from sadness, from a confusion of emotions he couldn't name. Gratitude, loss, hope, fear, all tangled together in a knot in his chest. Jimmy Hayes appeared beside him, put a hand on his shoulder. Didn't say anything, just stood there, this young American guard showing solidarity to a German prisoner. And somehow that made Fritz cry harder. The winter months were slow at the ranch, less work. Colder weather, though nothing like the winters Fritz remembered from Germany. January and February passed in a routine of limited work details, camp maintenance, and the slow gathering sense that the war was approaching its end. In March 1944, Fritz received a letter from his father. It had taken 4 months to arrive, passed through multiple censors, stamped and restamped with official seals. Fritz's hand shook as he opened it. The letter was brief. His father's handwriting had gotten shakier with age. Fritz could barely read some words. "Friedrich, your letter arrived. I have read it many times. You say you have changed. You say America is not what we were told. I do not know if this is true or if you write these things because you must. But I will tell you something. Your mother, before she died, she told me to raise you to be a good man. Not a good German, not a good soldier. A good man. If you have found goodness in America, if you have learned to see other people as human beings, then you are the man your mother wanted you to be. That is enough for me. The city is in ruins. The war goes badly. I do not know if we will see each other again. But if we do not know, that I am proud of you. Not for fighting, for learning. Your father." Fritz read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in the small box where he kept his few possessions. The cowboy boots Wild Bill had given him, a photograph of him and Jimmy Hayes taken at the ranch, a postcard of Texas that Klaus had bought for him at the camp canteen. And now this letter, evidence of transformation, evidence that change was possible even in the middle of war. April arrived. The wildflowers bloomed across Texas, turning the prairie into a carpet of color. Bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and flowers Fritz had no names for. He was back at Smithson Ranch helping with spring work, mending fences that had been damaged over winter, clearing brush, preparing for the growing season. One afternoon, Wild Bill called Fritz over to where he was working on a truck engine. "Need your help," Wild Bill said. "This carburetor's being stubborn." They worked together for an hour, taking apart the carburetor, cleaning it, reassembling it, working in the kind of comfortable silence that comes from mutual respect. When they finished, the truck started smoothly. Wild Bill wiped his hands on a rag. "You got a good feel for mechanical work," Wild Bill said. "Your father teach you that?" "Yes, in the forge. You learn to understand how things work together." Wild Bill nodded. What you gonna do after the war, assuming you survive and get to go home? Fritz was quiet for a moment. I don't know if I want to go home. Germany is not my country anymore. My country lied to me about everything that matters. So what then? I think maybe I stay here, in Texas, if they let me. Wild Bill looked at him. You serious? Yes, I learned good work here. I learned honest living. I learned that people can be kind even to enemies. I don't want to go back to a place where hatred is normal. Wild Bill was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would change Fritz's life. War's going to end soon, maybe this year. When it does, there'll be a need for good workers. Men who know the land, men who can be trusted. You prove yourself, Fritz, and I'll sponsor you. Help you stay legal. Give you a job. Fritz felt his throat tighten. You would do this for me. For the man you've become, yeah. Not for the soldier you were, but for the man standing in front of me right now. Who gives a damn about doing good work and treating people right? Fritz extended his hand. Wild Bill shook it. The handshake of two men making a promise. Two men who'd been enemies becoming something else. Not quite friends yet, but something close. That night back in the barracks, Fritz told Klaus about the conversation. Klaus grinned. You're going to be a cowboy, a German cowboy in Texas. That's the strangest thing I've ever heard. Is it stranger than you wanting to play baseball professionally? Fritz shot back. They both laughed, because it was absurd, all of it. Two German soldiers sitting in a prisoner of war camp in Texas making plans for an American future while their homeland collapsed into ruins. Absurd and impossible, and yet somehow real. May 1945. The news came through on a Tuesday afternoon. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had fallen. The camp went silent when the announcement was made. 4,000 German prisoners processing the end of everything they'd fought for. Some cried. Some sat in shocked silence. Some, the true believers, refused to accept it, called it Allied propaganda. Fritz sat on his bunk and felt nothing. No grief, no relief, just a strange emptiness. The thing that had defined his life for 9 years was over. The ideology he'd broken with was officially dead. And now he had to figure out who Fritz Weber was when he wasn't a German soldier anymore. That evening, Wild Bill came to the camp. Not officially, just to check on Fritz. They sat outside the barracks watching the sun set. How you doing? Wild Bill asked. Fritz shrugged. I don't know. My country lost. I should feel something, but I just feel empty. That's because you already left that country months ago. You've been living in a different place. Texas, America. Not in location, but up here. Wild Bill tapped his temple. You changed citizenship in your head long before the government made it official. What happens now? Now we wait. The government's got to figure out what to do with 400,000 prisoners. Some will go home right away. Some will stay in while Germany rebuilds. And some, if they're lucky, and if they've proven themselves, might get to stay permanent. Fritz looked at the man who'd given him boots and work and respect when he deserved none of it. Thank you, he said, for everything. Wild Bill waved it off. Thank me by showing up to work tomorrow. That fence ain't gonna fix itself. They sat in silence as darkness fell over Texas. The war was over. But for Fritz Weber, something new was just beginning. The long journey from hatred to understanding. From enemy to friend, from German soldier to Texas cowboy. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, suspicion, times when people looked at him and saw only the uniform he'd worn. But he had cowboy boots that fit. He had work that mattered. He had learned that kindness could break through propaganda better than any weapon. And he had discovered that transformation, real transformation, starts with something as simple as accepting a strip of bacon from someone who should be your enemy, but chooses to be human instead. The end of part 3.